The first is that ordinary life, human life, involves suffering. There's no way around the fact of anguish. Which is kind of liberating, and what a compassionate place to teach from. So that when you do suffer, you're not feeling like you're doing something wrong or that something went wrong in the path. It's actually just an intrinsic part of your own awakening. And that's also something to be said on retreat life as you maybe struggle with concepts day to day or as things come up, to just remember that the suffering and the darkness is part of the path. You turn those aspects of the psyche onto the path and utilize them. So the first noble truth is that suffering exists, and the word for suffering in Sanskrit is dukkha, D-U-K-K-A-H. Dukkha. So ka, kind of like a Akashic records, ka, it means space. Du means absence or lack. So dukkha is like the collapse of the spacious realm within. This tight field that we start to exist in and feel stuck, the collapse of our spacious nature. That's what happens when we suffer. Like the walls are closing in and we're met with this constricted fear. And I'm going to speak most explicitly on the first noble truth today because it's the first teaching and the most foundationally important. But I'm going to run through all of them so you know the bigger picture. The second noble truth is that reactivity is what causes suffering. So this is the revolutionary insight the Buddha had, and this is what shifted. You know, before he woke up, he knew, and everybody around him knew that there was suffering. There was death and decay all around. That was obvious. So the first noble truth wasn't revolutionary. But the second noble truth is where the insight is really drawn from. That suffering is not a cause of external circumstance, but of our reactivity to what's arising now. So reactivity, or the way that we respond to circumstance, is what causes suffering. The suffering caused from the fluctuations of living a life. In any one moment, whatever experience we're having is always two waves. It's that onset of stimulus, so the smell, the sound, the sight, the memory. And then the second wave is how we meet the first wave, our response to whatever stimulus is happening. So there might be hunger in meditation or boredom in meditation, and then there can be the soft receptivity of allowing that to be. Or you can meet it head on, like two waves crashing, and create a conflicting narrative. So that's why I said yesterday, there can be miserable conditions without existing within the depths of misery. So our reactivity to circumstance is what causes suffering, not the actual state of what's arising. That was his revolutionary insight. And it's an empowering one because it actually gives us the agency to choose the depths of our despair. Number 3, the third noble truth. Reactivity can cease. And that's what the Buddha called nirvana. That we can reach nirvana, we can reach awakening. And it's not some distant shore. It's not this esoteric, out there concept. Nirvana is right here, right now, having the agency to decide how you respond to the world around you as the confluence of circumstance and contingency are consistently changing. So it's actually a quite pragmatic realization. We can reach enlightenment, we can further evolve by knowing that we have the empowered agency to choose our response. And then the fourth noble truth outlines the Eightfold Path. The Buddha was a list maker. It's a recipe for ceasing your reactivity, for arriving at nirvana, for reaching the liberation of the gripping reactive response to the universe when it does what you don't want it to do.
What is this called? Sorry?
What's that?
What is this called? Number 4?
It's the Eightfold Path. That the certain modalities of behavior, cultivation, bhavana, mental aptitude, the right speech, the right meditation practices, the right livelihood, can lead to a holistic, non-grasping, extraordinary life outside of the ordinary anguish of suffering day to day. So I'll break it down into verbs for the first 3 at least. The fourth noble truth is the extensive list of the Eightfold Path, which I'll hopefully get to a bit tomorrow. Ordinary life involves suffering. That's the first noble truth. The verb for that you can start to tie in linguistically is examine, explore, get to know your suffering. Examine your suffering so that you start to cultivate a healthy relationship to difficulty. Because we tend to actually just add difficulty to difficulty. Like something's outside of what our preference is, and so we create a narrative and responsiveness about it, or reactivity about it, and then it just becomes a bigger beast. So, like Judith Hansen Lasseter's inquiry, queen of restorative yoga, she says, does getting your way really matter? Because that 7-year-old self is having a tantrum. But what happens if I don't get my way? And preferences are okay. Those are normal. It's what happens when you don't get those preferences met. So having a healthy non-attachment to whether or not your idealized situation is actually being realized. Because sometimes the situation is outside of your preferences, but actually becomes better than you ever could have imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And even if that's not the case, we're interested in training the spaciousness to host whatever difficulty is there. So the first noble truth, the verb we can attach to that, is just to explore and examine the ways in which we suffer and to make friends with them. The second verb would be to relax or to release. Relaxing reactivity to those moments that we feel in anguish. And then the third is to recognize the absence of suffering. So the third is like this promise from the Buddha that if you train in the methods, the depths of your suffering will subside. And one of the ways that you do this is by recognizing in your life you feel fully absent of suffering. And just notice the conditions internally that give rise to that state of liberation. Because I can tell you from experience that I've been in some of the most beautiful places in the world with just the right food that I want to eat and the 9 hours of sleep that's idealized in my system, and I have my green juice, and the external state might be ideal. But if the internal quality of presence is dissonant, it doesn't matter where you are and if your preferences are being met. Suffering is suffering is suffering. So when you're feeling the lack of suffering, just noting that it's not actually a result of what's happening in the external world around you, so that you can continue to connect back into that spaciousness. What's it like when you're awake and not consumed by details? So this is an important distinction. This is the noting or the observation of what's called genuine happiness or genuine contentment, which is to be explicitly distinct from circumstantial contentment. Circumstantial happiness, like the joy of receiving your favorite meal. That's great if it makes you happy, but if that's the only meal that's going to make you feel nourished, then you're going to suffer when they're out of kale. Right?
Or French fries.
Or French fries. Yeah. Right? So, it's beautiful to have the preference of really loving jazz music and that lighting you up and creating, stirring happiness within you. But if it has to be Miles Davis to reach that inner stability in you, then you're going to suffer when your children or your friends play something much different than that. So the inner content of genuine contentment rests outside of the circumstances, because the circumstances, maybe they are in your control for a moment, but that's going to change because circumstances are subject to the truth of impermanence. So if you're grasping on control of circumstance, you will suffer unless you practice the relinquish of control. Little tiny deaths throughout the day. So in a way, actually not getting your way is what matters more, because then you can train in the methods. Any questions or comments so far on this content?
I think I missed the third verb.
Third verb, recognize. So, building on the first noble truth of dukkha, the existence of dukkha, anguish and suffering. Another translation of dukkha that I really love is, so ka means space, but another translation is also wheels, because at the time of the Buddha, wheels were the way that things were transported. So ka is like this, the word that describes movement by wheel, by turning. And do, again, means absence or lack of or collapse. So it's like when the wheels collapse, when you can't get anywhere. because you're constricted and stuck with where you are right now. And sometimes what that looks like is just spiraling in this narrative of your own suffering, just like wallowing in it. And so there's different ways that we suffer, and there's different types of dukkha. So there's dukkha itself, which is just part of life. There will be suffering and sickness. That's dukkha. Death, decay. But there's three ways that we suffer. There's dukkha as the first way, which is like the suffering of suffering. So dukkha itself would be just getting sick or being exposed to something that's strongly outside of your preferences. Like getting stung by a bee. That's suffering. That sucks. But then there's dukkha, which is relating to the circumstance of that suffering in a way that contributes to greater suffering. And that's by our reactivity or our narrative. Like, why is this happening to me? How long is this suffering going to go on for? What did I do to deserve this? So the most painful thing about suffering is not the actual event itself, because that's impermanent, but actually the way that we get drowned or oppressed by its presence. So we're practicing the inner method here of skillful responsiveness to our sorrow and to our grief. Because unattended sorrow, unattended suffering is one of the most difficult emotions to endure. Unattended sorrow or grief. So the grief is the dukkha, the loss, the pain. But dukkha is when we relate to that pain in a way that causes further suffering rather than skillfully responding to it, attending to our sorrow. Okay, so here's another personal narrative example. I've gotten feedback from trainees in the past to share more about me, so check that off the survey form.